Once upon a time, there was a Neanderthal that lived in a cave in an area that was filled with wildlife. It was somewhat of a foresty type area filled with trees and whatnot. And the Neanderthal lived in a cave in that area, and he lived as Neanderthals do. His life was pretty simple, and all he did each and every day was try to hunt for food to eat to stay alive, and that's the totality of his life. One day, a modern man ventured into that area, found a clearing of land, and he began to chop down some trees in a nearby area, built him a log cabin, and he decided to stake a claim and live in the area and start a new life. And he was pleased because whenever he would go out to hunt, as said, the area was filled with all kind of wildlife and different types of trees and whatnot with fruit that he could eat and have a successful life, keep himself healthy. And so he was satisfied for the moment. One day, the modern man and the Neanderthal encountered each other. They were both out trying to hunt. They encountered each other and they looked at each other. The Neanderthal instinctively saw something familiar in the modern man, but he didn't really know or understand what what he was supposed to think about the modern man. The modern man looked at the Neanderthal and he realized that he was a Neanderthal, and he thought to himself, wow, I thought these beings were already extinct, but obviously there was a Neanderthal, a caveman, alive and well, still roaming the plains of the earth. And he marveled at that. So they sized each other up for a little bit and then they went on their ways. And the modern man encountered a deer and using his modern day equipment and whatnot, bows and arrows, he was able to secure the deer for food. And as he was going back to his cabin, he noticed the Neanderthal in a nearby tree on one of the lower limbs. And the Neanderthal was perched up on a limb and he was spying a buck right below that limb. So the Neanderthal jumps off the tree, lands on the back of the buck, and he grabs the buck around the throat and he's trying to bite the buck on the back of the neck, trying to choke it to death. But the buck, he was pretty determined not to be food for that day. So the buck shrugged off the Neanderthal off his back and went to charge him. And the modern man witnessed a somewhat sad but kind of humorous display of the buck trying to charge and gore the Neanderthal, and Neanderthal ducking and dodging and trying to get away from his would-be kill. So finally, the buck gives up and runs off into the forest, leaving the Neanderthal with no meat for food that night, and he would go hungry. So the modern man had a little pity for the Neanderthal. So he allows the Neanderthal to come with him and share in his kill. And he gave him some of his meat, and both of them feasted well that evening, had a pretty good dinner. And he went back to his cave, the Neanderthal, and the modern day man went back to his cabin. And so this kind of went on for a little bit, and the Neanderthal would struggle often, would struggle often with trying to survive. So again, the modern man took pity on the Neanderthal, invited him to be kind of like a partner, and he even invited him to come and live in his cabin. But unfortunately, the Neanderthal had no way of appreciating the modern luxuries in the cabin of the modern man. So he would begin to tear things up and misuse things and abuse things because he didn't know no better. He was a caveman, he was a brute. So the modern man was like, well, this isn't a good idea. So he escorted the Neanderthal back to his cave and he noticed something interesting. The Neanderthal seemed a little happy, excited to be back in his primitive area and surroundings. And so the modern man was like, okay, well, that's cool. That's just the way it goes. And one day, the modern man realized that winter was approaching. And so he began to gather firewood for the winter. And he looked around and he would see the Neanderthal just doing his thing, milling around, not really worrying or stressing over nothing. Um, by that time, even though he sent the Neanderthal back to his cave, he still allowed the Neanderthal to go with him to hunt, figuring that the Neanderthal would learn by osmosis how to make tools, how to make a bow and arrow, and what have you, and learn how to hunt more successfully as opposed to almost sometimes getting killed by the prey he sought after. Unfortunately, the Neanderthal never truly caught on how to make the modern tools, but it was okay. Um, the modern man reasoned that when they go out to hunt, the Neanderthal is actually good for certain things. Like he could easily skin the deer with his bare hands, and he could do things, such as that. That came in handy, and that would save him time to do other things. So it was an okay partnership that summer and that fall. But again, when winter approached, uh, he was around the Neanderthal and he noticed the Neanderthal was cold and shivering. So he took some of his firewood and he led the Neanderthal back into his cave and he put the wood in the proper formation, to build a campfire. And he grabbed two rocks, the modern man did, and he started clapping them together. And sparks started flying, and the Neanderthal looked with wide eyed amazement at the sparks. And then very soon, a fire was ignited and the wood started to burn. And the warmth spread throughout the entire cave. And the Neanderthal was pleased. And the modern man smiled at him. And he noticed the Neanderthal getting drowsy. So he decided to leave. He went back to his cabin. And they both got a good night's rest. The next day, the modern man noticed that the weather was a little bit more harsh. So he reasoned that a winter storm was approaching. So after they did what they did for that day, had their food and whatnot, he escorted he escorted the Neanderthal back into his cave the very same night and the next night. And he picked up two fire rocks and he handed the rocks to the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal looked at the rocks in, a little bit of dumbfoundedness. And so he took the rock in his left hand and he clocked himself upside his head. And the modern man was like, no, 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 that's not what you do. And the Neanderthal just kind of grunted a little bit. So he took the rocks from the Neanderthal and began to clasp them together again. And soon another fire was lit. The cave got warm again on that second night, and the Neanderthal had a slight smile on his face, happy, and the modern man was pleased. And so he goes back to his cabin. Again, they both get a good night's sleep. On the third day, the winter storm that the modern man thought was coming actually came. And luckily, the modern man had actually prepared for the storm. When they went out to hunt on the previous day, um, he sought after extra meat, food, just because he wasn't sure how long the storm would last. And so he wanted to be prepared for it just in case they couldn't go out and on that third night. And sure enough, the storm hit. It was pretty severe. And he escorted the Neanderthal into his cave again. He's like, well, we're not going to be going hunting today because the storm is too harsh. But not that the Neanderthal really understood what he meant, but they went back into the cave and he gave the Neanderthal two of the fire rocks along with the firewood. And he gave it to him to see if he knew what he was supposed to do with the rocks. The Neanderthal grunted a little bit, and then he took the rocks and he clasped them together as he looked in the eye of the modern man. And the modern man was like, "Yeah, looks like you might be catching on." And so what he did, he waited, and the Neanderthal looked at the rocks again with excitement. Suddenly, the modern man remembered that there was something he had to do. So he gets up, scurries out of the cave, goes to his cabin, and he reasons that the Neanderthal realizes what to do. And so he couldn't go back because by that time, the storm started raging, icy ice pouring down from the ground, pouring down from the sky, hitting the ground. He couldn't go back over to the Neanderthal's cave, so he had to stay put. Meanwhile, back at the Neanderthal's cave, he's holding the rocks. He's looking at the rocks. He's trying to figure out what to do. He know he's supposed to do something with the rocks, but he's not quite sure what. He looks at the wood on the ground. He looks at the rock. He takes the rock in his left hand, clocks himself upside his left temple. He gets a little woozy, doesn't realize what he did to himself. So he takes the rock in his right hand, clocks himself upside his left temple, knocks himself out cold. He falls over, KO'd by his own ignorance. And unfortunately, the storm was so harsh, the Neanderthal froze to death in his sleep. After a couple of days, the storm blew over. The modern man went out, you know, figuring that they're going to go hunt again. He noticed the Neanderthal was not outside as he usually is. The Neanderthal would typically get up early in the morning, would be milling around, and ever since they met, he would be out, kind of sort of waiting in the distance expectantly for the modern man to come out and make his appearance. But the Neanderthal wasn't there on that morning when the storm blew over. So he goes over to the Neanderthal's cave, peeks in. Hello? He's trying to call out to the guy, and there's no answer, just silence. So he kind of slowly creeps in, looking around. It's dark, it's a cave. Um, no lamps, no light, nothing like that. But he can see dimly because it's daylight, and he comes upon a gruesome discovery. He finds the Neanderthal dead. He sees the wood beside the Neanderthal's body. He sees the two rocks beside his upper torso. And looking at the scars on both sides of the Neanderthal's head, he can pretty well figure out what happened. He felt a little grieved by the situation, and he dug a grave, buried the Neanderthal, gave him a decent burial. He said a silent prayer, and he felt a little guilty about not coming back to check to see if the guy was okay. But how could he, since the storm was so bad? And as he, sat there lamenting over the Neanderthal's demise, insight came to him, and it was a comforting word. And what that insight told him was that he did not put the Neanderthal on this earth. Therefore, he was not responsible for the life of that Neanderthal. And so, armed with that sense of comfort, he left the cave. He went on a hunt for that particular day. He went on to live a successful life. He even got, he even thrived at that point. He started to thrive. And that's the end of the story. The moral of the story is this: those two rocks represent the Bible, the scriptures. Class, clapping the rocks against each other to build a fire for warmth and comfort and survival represents rightful interpretation and truthful understanding, real understanding. The fire ignited to give the warmth and comfort represents the influx of the Holy Spirit. The Neanderthal represents those that are primitive minded or have childlike understanding. The rocks being the scripture, they clock them up beside their heads, harming themselves. Hence, they go out into the world and do things like the Neanderthal, who try to choke and bite on the back of the buck's neck, wrestle it down, not understanding that there's a better way than having that kind of aggression, caveman like aggression. Um, Clapping the rocks upside the head represents the way people misunderstand and misinterpret the Bible. What do? They go out into the world, and just like that in that Neanderthal, they're aggressive towards the world. They hate on other people, not understanding what they're doing, and ultimately they use what they think they understand as benevolent information to ruin themselves or even destroy themselves, just like the Neanderthal. So We must learn to understand. We must get away from primitive, childlike understandings. We must get away from superstitious understandings of the Bible if we are to live successfully, righteously, have life and have it more abundantly like the modern man. Otherwise, there's only eventual ruin, harm, and ultimately death, just like the Neanderthal experienced. One of the most hardcore things or lessons about this particular parable is this: the modern man was a creation of God. Likewise, the Neanderthal. Unfortunately, the Neanderthal wasn't meant to understand. He had to die out, die off, so the modern man could thrive. As you can see, when the modern man tried to invite him into his cabin, the Neanderthal proceeded to destroy and tear it up. So he realized that they couldn't dwell together under those kind of circumstances. So those that are destined to understand, the Bible talks about as being God's elect. The others will be left behind. That's the sad but hardcore truth of humanity, the plight of humanity. However, a truthful understanding and has to come from God, and the only way God can give you rightful understanding of life, even how to interpret the Bible, even how to understand that you're not responsible for making other people understand. You try to drill things into people's head to make them understand, like the modern man tried to show the Neanderthal, who was not capable of understanding how to ignite that flame to keep himself warm. You got to get away from that, because you hold yourself back when you try to make others understand who are not capable of understanding. And you got to, at some point, realize when people are not capable of understanding. One of the problems we have with that particular scenario is people can be very intellectual and come across as super intelligent geniuses, but that's man made intelligence. That has nothing to do with spiritual intelligence. And you have to know the difference if you are to realize that you're not responsible for making people understand. You have to know the difference. And if you don't know the difference, then you might be a Neanderthal. You keep trying to drill people, trying to make them understand, but you can't see that they're not capable of understanding. You're probably a Neanderthal too. At some point, you got to realize, and realization comes with a clear mind, a cleansed consciousness. And this book, The Power of Spiritology, written by Dario Thomas, it is on sale at Amazon.com. It can assist you, be of great assistance, how to cleanse your consciousness. Go on to live successfully, have life more abundantly, just like the modern man. Don't buy into that. Well, it was Paul's declaration. The Messiah said, God wants you to have life and have it more abundantly. And he meant life in the here and now. It was Paul that contradicted that and said that you must be as sheep led to the slaughter, waiting for death to come at any moment. That's not victory. But again, that's another topic for another talk, to separate wheat from the tares. And also, many of us got to get that through our heads, that separating the wheat from the tares also applies to the Bible. And I've come across some things in the Bible that I've seen that I can prove it to you that it does apply to the Bible. But anyway, join, subscribe to the Spiritology Television Network. Subscribe. I will be doing more spiritual talks, hopefully to shed some spiritual light, spiritual insight to help you in your walk, in your journey, in this life. Again, the book, The Power of Spiritology, is on sale by Dario Thomas at Amazon.com. Thank you for listening. Hopefully, you were blessed by this lesson. Take care. God bless.